So as we talked about at the beginning, Jesus is sending his followers out on a road trip of their own. And he's sending them, if you caught that at the beginning, to all of the places he intends to go, meaning he's sending them to places he himself has not been to yet. Part of what they are going to do is to prepare the way of Jesus' coming. Now, he sends out, earlier in chapter 9, he sends the disciples out first. So he sends the 12 out to go and do similar work. And then in chapter 10, he draws the circle a little bit wider. And in this translation, it says he sent out 70. In some translations, it says it turns out 72. It's not that because the manuscripts themselves are not all that consistent. But either way, what we know is he sent out a large group of people, either 70 or 72, which is actually a special number in the life and times of God's people at the time. God's people at the time in the first century were really into numbers. And one of the things that they talked about, and you'll find this actually in Genesis, was there were supposedly at this time 72 nations of the earth. So by sending out 72 disciples, 72 followers of Jesus, he's basically saying we're sending this message out everywhere. That this thing that we are doing here isn't supposed to stay here. It is supposed to travel, and it is supposed to travel far. And in fact, not only far, but is supposed to eventually get to all God's people. So he's drawing that circle wider. Now, what's interesting is Jesus has really only been on the scene for a small amount of time at this point. He's maybe a third or a halfway through his ministry. In order to have 72 people to send out, it's got to be more than just the 12 that he specifically called. And we kind of forget this sometimes, that Jesus had his core group that he's with him, but there were all these other people who were attracted to by what he was doing and would journey with him along the way. And it is that group, some of whom have probably only been around and in this Jesus thing at the time for maybe a matter of months. So he's taking folks that are very early in their relationship with Jesus, because everybody is very early in their relationship with Jesus. Nobody has known him really except for his parents more than a couple of years. So he's taking these folks early in their journey and then saying, you can't stay here with me anymore. I need you to go out into the world and do something on my behalf. And everybody goes, okay. And he says, oh, by the way, though, when you go, he's very honest in the beginning. So when you go, caught the line, I'm sending you out as sheep unto the wolves. He's like, I know where you're going. May be a little bit dangerous. It may not be the safest thing I'm asking you to do. Many of these folks have probably not traveled very far in their lives, because most people at this time had not traveled very far in their lives. Most people were tied to the land and the ground that they cultivated, tied to their families, and it wasn't common for people to go or venture very far in the way that we know and do venture very far today. Nobody had invented the interstate highway system yet, or cars to drive on them. So he's asking them to do something out of their comfort zone, and then he goes even a step farther. I want you to do something out of your comfort zone, but not only that, don't take anything with you. Don't carry a purse. Don't carry an extra set of clothes. Don't take anything with you that you would normally take on a journey. Don't take any of that stuff that most of us would want to have with us. Right? How many of us, when we go out on, especially like on a long road trip, like have that emergency $100 bill stashed away? Right? You should, by the way. It's come in handy a lot in my life. I'm not going to ask where it is. Don't tell me. Right? But they said, don't do any of that. In fact, don't even take an extra set of clothing with you. So I want you to go to this place and do this thing that may not be the safest thing, and I don't want you to take anything with you that would make you feel safe. What on earth is Jesus up to? Why on earth would he tell them to do it this way? I mean, if we're thinking about kind of in our modern sense what it is that Jesus is asking them to do, he's basically saying, I want you to take a journey, and I want you to take a journey to somewhere you've never been before, and instead of going there on your own, I want you to hitchhike the whole way there. Now, I don't know about many of you, but there is not a lot of hitchhiking anymore. And I must confess, I've never done it because I'm of an age where we were actively discouraged from doing it. Now, for a longest time, actually up until only a few decades ago, hitchhiking of one variety or another was a pretty standard means of getting around, right? And before the age of the car, you may be walking along the road and somebody maybe comes along in a wagon, and you may actually hitchhike onto somebody's wagon to go a little bit further down the road. And then when the car came along, that was a common way. I've heard lots of stories from people that that's basically how you would get to school in the morning, right? Is you would hope that somebody would drive by and pick you up and take you where you needed to go. Up to, and really up until like the 1950s and 1960s, hitchhiking was a really, really common thing to do in this country and in other countries until it stopped being one. And it stopped being one for a couple of reasons. One is more and more people got cars. Right? More and more people had cars, and more people had second cars, so you had enough transportation on your own to get you where you needed to go. And then two, there was actually this really concerted effort, especially in the late 50s and early 60s, to tell you that hitchhiking probably and picking up hitchhikers was probably not the safest thing to do, right? And actually, if you want to Google, like, here's the thing I love about my job. A lot of times my job is Googling random stuff and then being amused by what I find. Now, the thing I don't like about my job is I have to be disciplined enough to not fall too far down that rabbit hole and realize I do actually have to come to a point with all of this. Otherwise, I would just stand up here and show you random things I found on the internet, which is mostly what I do, if you haven't figured that out. But this, I found one great example. So this is a picture of like a safety poster that went out like to people. It's like death in disguise, and it's this nice gentleman like holding out his thumb, like hitchhiking, And so this is a really concerted effort to say that this was probably not the safest thing to do. And so most of us who are kind of like my age or younger grew up in a world where there really just did not happen a lot, and we were actively discouraged, saying don't pick up hitchhikers. It's not a safe thing to do. Because you don't want to welcome a stranger that you don't know into your car because you don't know what would happen, right? And this has been standard advice for a long time. The disciples in their time face a similar problem where if they're going to go and do this stuff, they're going to need a place to stay. Right? Now, of course, there is no Motel 6. Nobody's leaving the light on for them anyway. Like, that doesn't exist anyway. But the fact that they're not carrying any money means that they can't even stay in the few places that you could trade a place to stay for some money. They're going to have to rely on the hospitality of strangers. And how you would do this in that time is you would go to a new town and you would kind of go to like the main kind of town square area, and you would wait there and until somebody came in the evening time and took you to their house. And it was just understood that that's how it worked. And if you lived in that town, it was understood that that's part of what you would do, is if there were strangers, if there were people who needed a place to stay, you would go and somebody would go and welcome you into their house. This is how things are. Now, for us today, that also feels really weird, right? We probably wouldn't go downtown and welcome a stranger to come stay in our house. Right? Most of us wouldn't do that because, and a lot of times, the reason we wouldn't do it is because we probably wouldn't feel safe. Not because we're not generous people, not because we don't want to be hospitable, and not because we don't love folks, but we wouldn't feel safe. We don't feel safe inviting people into our homes or into our cars that we don't own. That is conventional wisdom, and it's been conventional wisdom for a long time, which is why I find it really, really interesting that things like Uber and Airbnb even exist. Right? Because I've ridden in a lot of Ubers and I've stayed in a lot of Airbnbs. And that's a stranger welcoming you in to their car or to their home. And in fact, it was considered such conventional wisdom, and still considered is such conventional wisdom, that when these two businesses, which are now billion-dollar businesses, multiple billion-dollar businesses, went to go raise their first round of money, everybody told them they were crazy. Because nobody's going to want to get into some stranger's car, nobody's going to want to sleep in some stranger's home, and nobody's going to want a stranger sleeping in their home, and nobody's going to want a stranger driving in their car. Apparently, that's not true. And their stockholders will tell you that that's not true. So what is the difference? What's the difference between calling an Uber and picking up somebody on the side of the road who wants a ride. The difference is, and I think the difference that the people then at the time failed to see when they were pitching these ideas, is the difference is a sense of community around it. If I get into an Uber, right, it's not as, somebody knows that I did that. There is a record that I did that, right? That, if I stay in an Airbnb, somebody knows that I did that, and I have a profile on there, and the person who has the Airbnb has a profile on there, and we kind of get to know each other a little bit before we ever meet in person, and we know where we're going, and somebody knows that I did it. It's the same thing that the disciples, when they're going out in the town squares, doing it as well. Somebody knows, somebody else in the community knows that that person was taken into their home, right? There's a community around it, and that's the thing about this, is that oftentimes the safety that we seek in life doesn't come from the things that we have, it comes from the people we are with. Because while the disciples were sent out without a purse or extra money or anything else that we would consider helping us feel secure, they did not have an American Express card. What they did have was somebody else with them. Jesus sent them out in pairs. And the thing that I think we sometimes forget to value as much as we ought to value it is how important it is to be and have people around us who know about us and care about us and know where we are and know what's going on. That oftentimes the things that make us feel insecure or make us feel unsafe are not even necessarily a lack of resources or anything like that. What makes us feel safe and secure is that there are people around us that we know and that know us. Now, there was kind of a natural experiment with this, and in fact, a rather tragic one, but there was sort of a natural experiment of this idea that happened in 1995. So a couple things happened in 1995. There was a big earthquake in California, but the other thing that happened in 1995 was a huge heat wave that hit Chicago. For several days, this heat wave hit Chicago, and it was intense, and it was terrible. People lost power because they were running their air conditioning so much, and it actually resulted into a number of people who died because of the heat. And this is something that we always have to remember and that's one of the things they tell us now, right? If it's really hot outside, right, and maybe we might find that inconvenient that it's really hot outside, one of the standard pieces of advice now when it gets really hot outside is we're supposed to check on people, right? You check on your vulnerable neighbors, you check on your vulnerable loved ones, and so what they saw when they did studies after this thing that happened in Chicago was where the crisis hit worse and where it hit less badly. And one of the two contrasting communities that are actually butt up right next to each other, who are demographically and socioeconomically really, really similar, were the two communities of North and South Lawndale. Demographically, they're very, very similar. They butt right up against each other. The kind of people who live there kind of live in both places. They're both poorer areas of the Chicago area. And what they found out afterwards is that one community had a much higher death rate than the other. And they tried to go back, and as sociologists like to do, and figure out what was the difference between the two. And when they dug into it and they began to look and they did surveys with people and talked with folks about who lived there and who lived there, what the difference was, the difference between the two communities was quite simply community. In one community, a North community, where they actually had some of the worst responses, the worst tragedies of the whole thing, it lived in a place, that was a community that really did not have a lot of community. People didn't feel safe in leaving their homes. They were afraid if they left their homes, somebody might break in. If they did not feel safe walking down the streets, and even if they did, there weren't a lot of places for them to go. So in that place, most everybody stayed home for the whole time. And again, poor area, not everybody has air conditioning, and what they do doesn't work very well. South Lawndale, also poor area, was different. It was different in that there was a community there that was used to leaving their home. They did not feel unsafe leaving their home. There were places to go to. People would go and hang out in the grocery stores. They would go and hang out at the libraries. They would go and hang out in churches. They would go hang out in places where other people were around, and cool off before they went home. And of course, they were welcomed into those times and those places. The difference between the two things, the difference between those two areas, was a sense of community. It was a sense of safety. It was a sense of, I'm not afraid of my neighbor. It was a sense of being able to go and do and be in other places. The safety we seek often comes not from the things that we have, but the people around us. Now, what's very interesting about the story about Jesus is on one hand, he acknowledges that where he's sending them may not be the safest place, but on the other hand, expects them to be okay. Right? He expects them to find places to stay, and they do. And he expects them to find food to eat, and they do. And he says it may not always be the best food, but don't go looking just for the best food. That's not why you're there. But he basically says, I know that it looks scary out there, and sometimes it is scary out there, but at the end of the day, Jesus not only trusts his people, but at the end of the day, he trusts the communities that he's sending them to. He's like, if you go, you will find enough. Jesus says, if you go to these other places, these places I intend to go, you will find enough. And if you don't, then leave and go to the next place, because in the next place, there you will probably find enough. Jesus has this weird faith in the people around him. While he's there to bring a good news message, a message that we should have faith in him, the other thing that Jesus is showing in this passage and showing over and over again is that Jesus has faith in us. And in fact, the truth is, I'm guessing in that moment, Jesus probably had more faith in the communities around and the villages they were going to than the people themselves did. What would the world look like? How would it look different if we all had a little more faith, both in Christ, but also in each other? Having faith in each other, having trust in each other, believing that we live in a world that has enough in it, turns out to make all the difference. It made all the difference to the disciples 2,000 years ago. It made all the difference 20 years ago in Chicago, and it can make all the difference to us today. It's interesting that we're having this message today of all days, since today is Independence Weekend, right? We're getting ready to celebrate the 4th of July, the birth date of our country. And I've always loved this time of year, and I always love these kind of moments because I love the opportunity to go back and really understand and dig into the ideas that founded the country we live in. And I'm not going to spend a whole time on this because that'd be a whole other sermon, and one's enough. But I do want to remind us of this today, which is that great line that we all know and probably have written in our hearts. We hold these truths to be self-evident, that all men are created equal, that they are endowed by their Creator with a certain inalienable rights, that among these is life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. Those founding fathers set out with a pretty radical idea, and the pretty radical idea was that they could trust each other and that we should trust each other. At that time, there was this idea, and actually was the dominant idea of the time and for the centuries before, was that people couldn't be trusted. That's why we needed kings. We needed kings and queens to lord over us because those people were somehow more special than we were, and us common everyday folk shouldn't be trusted to rule our own lives, let alone come together to rule our own country. That idea was seen as rather crazy 100 years before the time of the revolutionaries, and was still considered not wise at the time of them. The radical belief that the founding fathers had was a belief in each other. That by work that they could actually trust one another and trust people to govern themselves well. That if given the opportunity to do good, be given the opportunity to build something good, to be given the opportunity to share and bless one another, on the whole, people would do it. Not every time, by no means. Jesus said the same thing. But on the whole, over time, the founding fathers had this radical idea that Jesus had too, which is that people are good. I will tell you, sometimes I get a little bit nervous about what it is that I say up here. I respect the fact that I get to stand up here and you all, at least out of politeness, sit there and listen to me. And I sometimes wonder how well this is going to be taken. And I don't consider myself a radical preacher by any means, and I don't consider myself a controversial preacher by every means. But as I've woken up this morning, I must confess I had a weird amount of anxiety about the controversial idea that people are good. But I think we live in a time when that's a controversial idea. I think we live at a time when there's so much money and so much energy put behind trying to convince us of the opposite, that to stand up here and to say, well, wait a minute, what about at the end of the day, if we really truly do believe we are all created in the image of God and have God's Holy Spirit in us, then there must be something good in there. Is it perfect? No. Are we always perfect? No. Are we created equal, which means we have equal capacity to do good and evil? Yes, absolutely. But do the sheep outnumber the wolves? I think they do. And when the sheep get together and choose to be in community with one another and work together and to bring God's good about in the world, there is no end to what we could do. There is no end to what we can do when people are willing to be the kind of community that God has called us to. And the choice basically comes down to this. What do we choose to see? What do we choose to see around us? Do we choose to see what we don't have? Do we choose to see the coins that aren't in our pocket and the extra set of clothes that we don't have with us? Or do we choose to see what we do have? That person that's journeying with us and the blessing of God we carry with us. Do we choose to see scarcity, everything the world lacks? Or do we choose to see abundance, all the blessings that God has put into the world for us to enjoy? We as a community, as a church, are called to be a people who see abundance. We are called to be a people who see opportunity, who see neighbors that are in need of love, neighbors who are not perfect, neighbors who annoy but Jesus out of us sometimes, but are still worthy of love and grace not because they're so special, but because God is. And the truth is, the founding fathers saw abundance around them and chose to trust in it. Jesus saw abundance around him and chose to trust in it. And what's remarkable is that they both did that, and neither one of them had ever been to Costco. And if you ever want to see abundance on display, go to Costco. We are invited to be the people of abundance. We are invited to be the people of generosity. We are invited to be the people who choose to see the good in the people sitting next to us and around us, rather than always focusing on the bad. And what's interesting to me now is that we seem to be living through a time when that's a very countercultural idea. But sometimes, and in fact a lot of times, the gospel is countercultural. And the way that it is today is it calls us to do something important. It calls us to focus on the good that God already put into the world, the good that we discover through one another, and the good that is inside of all of us. Because here's the thing. If we choose to recognize the good in others, we are then required to see the good in ourselves. If we choose to see the good that can come out of the community and the neighbors around us, then we are required to see the good inside of us that can come out as well. That is what we do on our trip, wherever it may be, whether it's down the street, whether it's across town to Hayes, whether it's across the state, wherever it is. We are called to be bearers of God's good grace because we have been made in God's image and called good, because God is good and the Spirit who is with us is good, and we live in a world full of abundance. The only question has only ever been, from 2,000 years ago and today, is if we choose to see it. My hope and prayer is that we will all choose to see it. Amen.